A rhythmic, metal-on-metal grinding echoed from the portside atmospheric recycler. Nobody else on the bridge of the obsidian spire seemed to notice the failing vent. They were too focused on the central holotable. Jackson Thorne stood in the rear observation alcove, grinding his back teeth together. The artificial gravity in the command center was calibrated for celestial primaries. It sat at roughly twice standard Earth norm. Every micro-shift in his posture sent a dull, burning ache through his joints. He kept his breathing shallow. He refused to show strain. Archon Valerius Kalen stood at the center of the room. The Archon's crystalline armor fractured the blue light of the tactical display into sharp, cold prisms across the bulkheads. Kalen pulled up a deep space telemetry scan of the hollow grave sector. It was a dead rock, a scorched husk of a planet. But clustered in orbit and scattered across the ash-choked surface were thermal blooms the size of small moons. Behemoths. Extinction-class void predators. Dozens of them. Jackson touched the cheap, stamped alloy of the non-essential trainee badge pinned to his tactical rig. His thumb traced the rough edges. He looked at the behavior algorithms scrolling beside the planetary projection. Predatory dominance didn't look like this. Apex creatures didn't group in tight, static formations unless they were terrified. A secondary readout blinked yellow on the lower quadrant of the holotable. A low-frequency harmonic tremor was vibrating beneath the planet's obsidian crust. Kalen glanced at it, waved a four-fingered hand, and dismissed the warning. Residual tectonic settling, the Archon stated. His voice was a smooth, synthetic chime. Jackson stared at the tremor data. If he could just map the submission frequency to the... No, Kalen wasn't even looking at him. Jackson stepped forward anyway. The gravity fought his boots. Sir, they aren't massing for a feeding frenzy. They're establishing a perimeter. Kalen did not blink. He turned his head a fraction of a degree. Tier 0 personnel are here to observe, Trainee Thorne, not to hypothesize. I wish I could say Kalen was just being arrogant. What waited in that dead rock didn't care about tier rankings. Stay close. The obsidian spire dropped out of slip space an hour later. The visual feed flooded the main panoramic screen. The reality was far worse than the holotable projections. The behemoths weren't just grouped. They were kneeling. Over 300-kilometer-long leviathans floated in the void or crouched on the ashen surface. Their heavily armored plating, thick enough to shrug off concentrated railgun batteries, was dull and lifeless. Their massive heads were bowed toward the planetary crust in perfect, terrifying synchronization. They were not fighting. They were not feeding. They were submitting. Kalen's jaw tightened. A microscopic crack in the Archon's composure. He tapped a command sequence into the console. Deploy Vanguard scouts. Tier 2 operators only. Find out what is holding them there. Across the bridge, Vorn stood near the primary airlock. The Vanguard commander was 8 feet of muscle and dense, obsidian-scaled armor. Vorn caught Jackson's eye. 2 days ago, Vorn had watched Jackson in the lethal gravity conditioning chambers. Jackson had pushed through microfractures in his shins just to finish the simulation. Vorn had recognized a raw, ugly survival instinct that the higher tiers had bred out of themselves millennia ago. Now, looking at the silent graveyard of god beasts, Vorn gave Jackson a single, grim nod. The dropship detached from the spire. It ignited its thrusters, cutting a bright blue scar through the dark as it broke the dead planet's atmosphere. Telemetry streamed across Kalen's console. 6 strong biosigns. Weapons hot. Adrenaline levels nominal for obsidian-scaled kin. Surface is stable. The scout leader's voice crackled over the bridge comms. The audio was thick with static from the ash clouds. No movement from the behemoth targets. They are entirely docile. Moving to investigate the central crater. Jackson watched the secondary readout on the far monitor. The tectonic harmonic. The detail Kalen had dismissed. It was spiking. The frequency was accelerating, climbing from a low rumble into a jagged, erratic wave. Then, the audio feed shrieked. Not a scream. A wet, synchronized snap. 6 flatlines. Instantaneous. No weapons fire. No breach alerts. No panicked shouting over the comms. Just 6 Tier 2 hearts stopping in the exact same microsecond. Report, Kalen snapped. Silence. A subterranean psionic pulse rippled up from the planet's crust. It was invisible on the optical feeds, but the ship's sensors screamed as it slammed into the hull of the obsidian spire. Jackson tasted copper. The rhythmic grinding of the atmospheric recycler instantly morphed into a high-pitched, agonizing whine. Crew members staggered. Several junior officers collapsed to the deck plates, clawing at their skulls. Blood wept from Kalen's auditory canals. The psychic pressure was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating blanket of pure malice trying to push their brains out through their spines. Jackson dropped to one knee, his chest heaving, his vision blurring at the edges as his nervous system overloaded. Ray's psionic baffling. Kalen barked. The Archon gripped the edges of the holodable, his knuckles white, fighting to stay upright. Maximum output. Lock down all bulkheads. The ship's internal dampeners flared to life. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the deck. The crushing weight in the room abruptly stabilized. The pressure behind Jackson's eyes receded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. Crewmen gasped for air, pulling themselves up by the consoles. The biomonitors flashed green. The shields were holding. Kalen straightened his crystalline armor. The Archon exhaled a long, steady breath, brushing a microscopic speck of ash from his polished gauntlet. Threat contained, he announced. The synthetic chime of his voice carried a note of distinct, unwavering smugness. The localized psionic anomaly is blocked. Navigation. Calculate a stable geosynchronous orbit. We will catalog the remains of the Vanguard scouts and extract the behemoth carcasses for processing. A highly profitable expedition. Around the cavernous bridge, the suffocating tension evaporated. The junior officers slumped heavily against their consoles, wiping thin trails of purple blood from their auditory canals. Even Vorn unlatched the heavy magnetic lock on his rail rifle, letting the massive weapon hang loosely from its tactical sling. They had survived the Deathworld trap. The superior, infallible technology of the celestial primaries had held the line against the dark. Jackson stayed on his knee. The dampeners were humming with a reassuring rhythm, but the yellow warning light on his secondary monitor was still blinking furiously. The tectonic tremor hadn't stopped. It was multiplying. The first pulse hadn't been an attack. It had been a throat clearing. The dead planet cracked open. A fissure 2,000 kilometers long violently split the obsidian crust. Magma boiled into the freezing vacuum of space, instantly flash freezing into towering, jagged monuments of black glass. From the glowing chasm, the stellar progenitor rose. It was not a beast. It was a tectonic plate given sentience, a leviathan of dark matter and blinding radiation that utterly dwarfed the kneeling behemoths. 300,000 years of apex evolution, all of it reduced to a single. The true psionic wave hit. The obsidian spire's dampeners didn't just fail. They detonated. Showers of white-hot sparks rained down over the command decks. The pressure wave bypassed physical armor entirely, slamming directly into the central nervous systems of every living creature aboard with the force of a dying star. Kalen dropped like a stone. The Archon lay paralyzed on the deck, his crystalline armor scraping the floor, his eyes wide and fixed, entirely incapable of moving his lungs to breathe. Vorn crashed down hard beside the primary airlock, his massive 8-foot frame locked in an agonizing state of complete neural submission. The entire crew was frozen, trapped in their own bodies by a predator that demanded absolute stillness. Jackson fell hard against the bulkhead. Pure, unfiltered terror flooded his veins. His mammalian brain screamed at him to curl into a ball, to lower his heart rate, to wait for death. But as his lungs struggled for oxygen in the brutal artificial gravity, something old and ugly snapped awake in his cerebral cortex. The evolutionary override. When flight is completely impossible, the human body chooses violence. Adrenaline flooded his system, cold and sharp, bypassing the paralyzed neural pathways and forcing his muscles to fire against the crushing weight of the god-beast's mind. He dragged himself to his feet. Every joint in his body popped and protested. He limped slowly past Kalen's frozen, terrified eyes, ignoring the Archon completely. Jackson reached the EVA locker. He pulled the standard pressure helmet over his head and locked the mechanical seals. The sharp, chemical smell of standard-issue pressure suit sealant hit his nose. It smelled exactly like the locker rooms back in the Tier 0 training camps. Grounding. Familiar. Real. He stepped into the airlock. He didn't look back at Vorn. He hit the cycle button. An unarmed human in a standard pressure suit floated into the silent void to stare into the 6 burning suns of a 2-kilometer-long god beast. The progenitor shifted its massive gaze. The entity's focus was not a physical pressure, but a terrifying, omniscient excavation of his very cells, peeling back the layers of his humanity to read the unbroken, bloody lineage of a species that had survived by sheer, stupid, relentless defiance against a universe that constantly tried to eradicate them. The god beast blinked. The crushing pressure in the void vanished instantly. A low, rumbling frequency vibrated through the suit columns, carrying a distinct, heavy note of profound respect, before the Leviathan slowly sank back down into the molten crust of the planet. The paralysis faded across the ship. Crewmen gasped violently for air. Kalen pulled himself up by the holodable, staring blankly at the viral suit cam telemetry broadcasting to the network. The Archon's hands were shaking. The Council just processed the feed, Kalen rasped, his synthetic chime replaced by a hollow, breathless static. They created a new classification for humanity. Tier Null. Jackson walked past the rear observation alcove. He did not stop at the back of the room. He pulled out a chair at the central command table and sat down heavily under the crushing gravity. "Are we leaving, Archon?" Jackson asked. Kalen finally met his eyes, offering a slow, deliberate nod of absolute submission. "On your order, Commander." Jackson looked down at his chest plate. The cheap, stamped alloy of the trainee pin was gone, torn away during the brutal pressure shifts of the airlock cycle. In its place rested the heavy, obsidian-scaled insignia of the Vanguard, reflecting the cold, blue light of the distant stars. He exhaled, feeling the heavy gravity finally settle into something he could carry.